It's working.
Alrighty, we can get things going. Well, hello everybody. Um, Thank you for coming to our panel, New York City and a Full Employment Society. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Andres Bernal. I'm a doctoral student at the New School and a lecturer at CUNY Queens College and the School of Labor and Urban Studies, as well as a fellow at the Post-Growth Institute and the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And I'm very excited to introduce my fellow panel members today. We have Michael Menser, who is an assistant professor of philosophy and urban sustainability studies at Brooklyn College and the co-founder of the Participatory Budgeting Project in New York City, as well as Rebecca Lurie, who is the founder of the Community and Worker Ownership Project at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and the Murphy Institute, where she also serves as the faculty in the Urban Studies Department. So I will be serving as your moderator, as well as getting things started off here with some an opening presentation. So what I'd like to do to kind of start things off is kind of frame some of the developments that have happened over the last decade in New York City, and offer a sort of conceptual strategy that brings together these political developments and approaches to policy and organizing, together with the MMT modern monetary theory paradigm around this concept of full employment society. And I'm also going to attempt to integrate an approach to MMT that both draws from the research in economics and heterodox economics, as well as some of the ideas that are being proposed through the approach in the humanities or in social theory. So to get things started off, last month, we had the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And there was a lot of conversation around, reminiscing about this time and the way that it had such an impact on the political discourse in this country and spread to basically every major city around the country. And so I think this is a very interesting point of departure to look at the last 10 years, and particularly 10 years in New York City of very interesting political and policy experiments. So in addition to Occupy Wall Street, that fall, we also had the founding of the Participatory Budgeting, or PB, project in New York City as well. In 2014, we had the Worker Cooperative Development Initiative, supported by the City Council and the Small Business Services part of city government, to develop this initiative that started off with a little over $1 million and has increased its funding every year in order to incubate, support, and grow the worker cooperative ecosystem and economy here in New York City. We've also seen the growth and interest in community gardens and community land trusts. We've seen the growth of mutual aid networks that are, among other things, really helping to develop our rethinking of public safety away from punitive measures and the growth of policing, and towards the idea that we actually need to meet social and human needs as well as environmental needs in order to address some of these crises that the country is experiencing. We've seen the Public Banking Coalition formed over the last 10 years and really grow and develop its influence to where New York City is advancing a local initiative in its own city council and pushing for a New York City public bank. And in many ways, this has kind of been framed within this international focus on the power of cities and urban spaces to advance progressive and radical politics within the neoliberal era. One example of this initiative is the Fearless Cities agenda and network that had its conference in New York City in 2018, which featured Speaker Ana Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, and our very own Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And in addition to this municipal organizing and some great initiatives, we've also seen developments at the state level, including a Democratic Socialist Caucus pushing a legislative agenda in state politics. We've seen the Housing Justice for All Coalition win some very, very important victories over the last few years, as well as environmental legislation coming from organizing at the state level, very influenced by New York City as well. We have a push for a state level single payer healthcare system that's also been very important. And then at the federal level, we have seen very transformative elections in of course, the victories of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jamal Bowman, who first, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Green New Deal resolution, which obviously set a framework for this development and innovation in policy and politics. But in addition, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, and the rest of the squad have really developed some pretty fantastic policy proposals, including the Green New Deal for public housing, the Public Banking Act, the Green New Deal for public schools, and have been fundamental in the Build Back Better agenda, which includes very important environmental components, which can be said to be a part of the greater Green New Deal vision. So all of this, I would argue, represents really, really important developments in democratic experimentalism, in structural reforms, and in institution building that is very reminiscent of another time of big progressive transformations, of course, the mid-century New Deal and the civil rights movement, which, of course, the caveat that we are in a very different moment, and we have learned lessons from that era. And we also live in the moment of a pandemic and the climate crisis as well. So there are still many issues with New York City politics. In addition, even though we've made these developments, of course, there are issues in housing that continue to be very serious: transportation, schools, segregation, the prison industrial complex, and also, interestingly enough, since the pandemic, an exodus in public servants leaving the public sector amidst COVID and the COVID response, and a perception of failure on behalf of the mayor in this development. A lot of this has been around confusion and an inability to really set an agenda where public servants feel protected through the orders to go back to work in person. So questions remain about how New York City can accelerate many of these developments that can contribute to other cities around the world, where we've seen important things happening, such as Berlin, Vienna, and others as well, given the cultural and political role that New York City represents as kind of this capital of the world. And as I mentioned, the insights since the mid-century New Deal and civil rights movement. So I want to now offer a strategy for framing our political organizing and our policy agendas that can overcome what I think has been a bit of a dilemma over the neoliberal era, which we've now been really trying to get at. And this is, of course, the dilemma of choosing whether we're going to focus on micro versus macro strategies, or in-system versus out-system approaches. And this strategy is based on integrating scales of policymaking and political organizing. And so the approach is premised on an understanding that scale is not simply a matter of geography, of quantity, or of materiality, but it's actually an abstracted political process that mediates different overlapping levels of participation and is dependent on the legal and the institutional organizing and ordering of space, of political subjectivity, and on the quality of social participation. And by that, I mean, in addition to other things, of course, inclusion versus exclusion in access to resources and in having a voice in the political process, not just in formal elections, but in everyday life. So this speaks to a kind of interdependence that we see that is neither fully or totally deterministic and constraining, nor is it fully independent or external. So that is to say that what we do at the micro, the meso, or the macro both has an element of autonomy to it and is also conditioned by higher levels of structuring. So this implies a kind of continuous multi-directional influence and impact. So as an example of this, we could see in the public banking initiatives that currently exist. New York City is, of course, pushing for a New York City public bank, but very quickly we see how it is important to change the legal infrastructure for public banking at the state level. And of course, that only opens up that this is all mediated by a federal set of laws and legal infrastructures for banking and finance in general that have to be addressed as well. So everything that we're doing in public banking at the municipal and local level is very important, is changing political discourse, is changing what we think is possible, but also is conditioned by what we can do at these other levels as well, which is very important. So I would argue that our approach to policy and political organizing that can integrate these different levels and figure out ways to leverage politics at these different levels. So if we're developing and expanding worker cooperatives at the municipal level, identifying what are the key legislative changes, antitrust law, approaches to fiscal policy and investment, unemployment that, exist and function at different levels will only accelerate our developments. And at the same time, these municipal agendas are critical to developing the knowledge and the know-how and the culture that is necessary that for when we win these bigger macro changes and reforms, we can implement them in a much more effective way. So this brings us to the issue of full employment. Now, of course, full employment is, interestingly enough, defined in different ways. One would imagine just by the name that full employment indicates using the maximum capacity that we have and the maximum participation of those that are willing to work. However, the BLS defines full employment in a different way. The Bureau of Labor Statistics defines full employment as an economy in which the unemployment rate equals the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NIRU. In this sense, full employment actually assumes that there is a natural rate of unemployment that simply exists out there in the economy. And we can say that's 5%. We can say that's 3%, but of course, for many marginalized communities, it's actually much higher than that. And this is, of course, taken as some kind of objective and just natural economic fact. From this perspective, how we define full employment becomes very important and critical, and this is where I draw on the insights from MMT, or modern monetary theory, which very importantly rejects both the conventional theory of what inflation is and the conventional theory of money as a commodity. So without getting too much into the details, and of course, to learn more about MMT, you can read Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth or Pavlina's book on the job guarantee. But what is important here is that MMT rejects inflation as simply a representation of the quantity of money that's in the economy, and this idea that due to the laws of supply and demand, money loses its value simply if it just gets introduced into the economy. But instead, it brings attention to the notion that inflation is rather a question of capacity, a question of available resources, and a political question of distribution in the process of administering prices. In addition, and what MMT is most known for is rejecting the idea that money is a finite thing that we have to run around and chase, and it is passively representing some other immediate and imminent economic activity, whether that be trade or even production itself, and instead offers an understanding of money that is premised on law and governance, and that affirms that credit and the issuance of credit and investment precedes the act of revenue. That is to say, money through most of history, with the exception of times that we have imposed limits through some gold standard or other kind of imposition, money is actually something that can mobilize and coordinate production through both the act of extending credit and also accepting returns and payment of taxes or the receivability of payments for anything from legal disputes, contract settlements, and taxes as well. And through this understanding, it kind of inverts our understanding of what money is. We no longer focus on taxpayers being the people that lend our government money, but rather this is inverted. And of course, we understand that any authority can come up with its unit of account and has an infinite capacity to spend that unit, constrained only by the stability of its productive capacity and other politically mediated dynamics. So this is a very important set of insights in how we understand the difference between unemployment, employment, and the job guarantee. So one of the things that I would argue is a shift in typically how we understand macro policy is that employment and property itself is actually to a significant degree a monetary phenomenon. And what do I mean by this? Well, this means that people seek income, they need income in dollars, and if they don't receive it or don't receive enough, there can be very big problems. And there are decisions to be made about how and to who that we extend this credit and investment towards. Now, under our current model, of course, we have in a way outsourced this capacity to invest to private actors most interested in their own profits, private banks, a private financial system, and of course the naturalizing of unemployment as simply, well, there's not enough money, or other public vital public needs that are seen as part of a competitive battle over a scarce amount of money, where taxpayers are ultimately the people that finance everything from universal health care to a transition to a just renewable economy, et cetera, et cetera. By understanding employment, unemployment, and the quality of what we do and how we define employment as a monetary phenomenon, we can then open up questions about full employment, that is, the maximum use of our capacity, to qualitative dimensions about what is the purpose of work and what do we want to do as a society, bringing back this idea of democratic coordination at the macro level, which has spaces of agency and administrative agency and nuance at meso and micro levels as well. Of course, thinking about a full employment society moves us beyond the idea that this is just an economic issue of somehow reaching certain, neutral, sterile economic categories, but really emphasizing that we're talking about a society that values and seeks full employment, and all of the cultural and qualitative dimensions that this has around racial justice, around gender justice, around environmental and ecological justice, etc. And as part of a full employment society, the job guarantee, which of course plays a central role in ensuring that we reach full employment, that is to say, anybody who cannot find a job with the private sector because, as MMT recognizes, the private sector alone, or the profit-driven sector alone, has no interest and simply cannot guarantee everybody a dignified job. So in this sense, the job guarantee basically says, as a right and as a way to ensure that we use our resources to our best and full capacity, we will guarantee you a job. Furthermore, we affirm that in not investing, in choosing not to use its fiscal capacity, the government, who controls dollars, allows for unemployment to exist and to grow. So it politicizes this very important level. Furthermore, as my colleague Rowan Gray has argued, the job guarantee brings questions of labor and work very similar to battles over K through 12 public education, where the question wasn't how do we plug people into a job, but rather what is the function and the purpose of an education, a right to an education for all children and even young adults and beyond, right, if we want to take it into higher education as well. So similarly, work and jobs doesn't simply become something to fulfill private interests or naturalize assumptions about automation, et cetera, but rather political questions about what is the purpose of participation in production and the social provisioning process itself. And this, I think, has very, very exciting implications when we are capable of reframing that. So this is a qualitative issue around which resources we choose to mobilize and for what, and how we can develop the institutions that can meet people where they are and ensure a kind of human flourishing in their administrative capacity. And I think this is where many of the developments of municipal politics and the innovations come into play in a very important way. So with that said, I think, I'd like to now pass it over to Professor Menser to talk about some of his experiences in participatory budgeting and economic and green democracy.
Thank you, Andres, for that wonderfully comprehensive introduction, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today in this really important conference that's connecting some serious spheres here, right? Under this, under the rubric of the job guarantee, but as Andres laid out, it interconnects on so many different levels. And I'm gonna go next, and then I'll pass it off to my colleague, Rebecca Lurie, who's really gonna continue to flow on a couple of these topics as well. And I'm going to share screen and go to a slides presentation, and there you go. Is that visible to everybody? Could someone just say yes?
Yes.
No? Great, thank you. So local participatory budgeting for sustainability and resilience funded by a federal job guarantee. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is something that I've wear a couple of different hats, and three of my hats are implicated in this presentation. One is, as Andre said, I'm the founding president of the board of the Participatory Budgeting Project, which is a nonprofit that brought PB from Brazil to the United States. It's our 10th year anniversary of the nonprofit. I actually just stepped off the board, which I'm very excited about, because PBP is really doing fantastic work and about to go into its next stage, and it is doing really well.
Mike, I'm sorry, I want to ask you to go to the present screen because it'll show up.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, that's better.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So, so that's the PBP hat. The other hat is I'm the associate director of public engagement for something called the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, and we work with literally 45 different city, state, and federal agencies in New York and at the federal level to increase the health and resilience of Jamaica Bay and the million people who live around it. The third is I am the co-founder, really the assistant founder to Rebecca Lurie of the Community and Worker Ownership Project, which is based at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And there's a curricular component to this, which Rebecca especially will talk about. Now, so I'm, teaching these various spots, and I'm in a big fight with my local power utility, but that's for another day. But I think the public utilities really figure in this as well. So PB gets started 10 years ago this fall, same time as Occupy Wall Street is happening. And here you can see the original icon here, and we'll explain more about PB and how it functions in a couple minutes. And here you can see some political figures who have upped their game. And there's Jumaane Williams, who's the public advocate and is contemplating governor. There's the new comptroller for the city of New York, Brad Lander. And here is someone who voted in Queens during a participatory budgeting process, named mentioned by Andres a couple times, AOC. And here we were also doing participatory budgeting at Brooklyn College. So you can kind of see the different scales at work with PB. And again, this has been going on for about 10 years. And then two other major legislative initiatives. Andres also noted the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative, which is basically funding from city council that goes to developers to help support the creation and evolution of worker cooperatives. And another one not mentioned by Andres, but I will talk a lot about tonight, is something that gets called the city's Climate Mobilization Act, which passed in 2019 and is a set of bills. And there's basically 4 set of bills that were passed. The first 2, Local Laws 92 and 94, require all new buildings and buildings undergoing major roof renovations to be covered with solar panels, green roofs, or some combination of the 2. The laws also require all buildings to reduce urban heat hazards. This was massively opposed by the most powerful constituency in New York City, which is called the Real Estate Board of New York, and they lost. That in itself is a huge, huge deal of much political consequence, which we could talk about later or not. But this is a big deal. And this also shows you the decarbonize as well as the decommodify aspect, 2 of the themes at this conference. The second is Local Law 95, which goes into how you calculate the efficiency grades of these different legislative acts with respect to buildings and energy and water. And the Local Law 96 also establishes a kind of financing to help do the upgrades. And Local Law 97 also specifies a number of different, again, in that decarbonization theme, another set of activities or actions that buildings have to do in order to reduce emissions or the carbon footprint of these buildings. And in New York City, buildings are the largest source of carbon, of emissions due to the heating and energizing and material use of the buildings. So where's the money for it? So there is a kind of financing scheme. You won't be shocked to know that there hasn't been much happening in that regard. By the way, I need a photo of a digital wallet. I'm sure some of you have never even seen this thing. This is called a wallet. That's a zipper, and it's empty. So how do we finance these things? Well, it's interesting because I think that the job guarantee is not the way I usually think about the financing of these kinds of projects, but Alexander Kolokotranos, who's a graduate student at Yale, who I believe is on right now, and hey, Alex, wrote a fantastic piece about this, which I'll show in a second, about thinking how PB could use the job guarantee to really have a much more democratic participation with respect to proposals and projects to address some goals set by the community. So here the idea is, how do we get not just accountability and transparency, but create actual projects that benefit communities in ways defined by those communities, which fit the needs, histories, and aspirations of particular places. And I love this, this is from Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, jobs with purpose and communities with power. So participatory budgeting. So one way of just sort of understanding the distinctiveness of PB, if you look on this image at the left, right, this is all too familiar. There's a big group of people over here on the left. That's the audience, that's the public. And there's white guys in suits over on this side. These are the power brokers. These are elected officials. These are the agency people. And they kind of dictate what's happening. And then these people have an opportunity to say, yes, no, we don't like it. We do like it. Why not this? And these people may or may not listen. On the right is all the people at the table are actually determining the agenda and which direction the conversation is going. And they even get to make a project. And that's participatory budgeting. This is from a participatory budgeting process in Taiwan. So PB is a process where the community in some jurisdiction designs the process. They brainstorm ideas how to address community needs. They develop proposals to fulfill those ideas or to articulate those ideas in concrete terms. They usually work with city agencies when they're doing this, right? Because the proposals have to be vetted, whether it's a proposal to fix a street or fix a park or to create an addition to a school. You have to be working with the relevant folks who understand the technical and financial requirements of that. And then the community decides. So not only does the community generate the proposals, but the community determines which proposals receive the funding. And there's an image just of Alex's wonderful essay, 3 ways to design a democratic job guarantee, in which he brings in participatory budgeting as one way to do that. And so again, with PB, there's a pot of money. It's secured. There's particular rules about how it can be spent. Maybe it's for capital funds, maybe it's for programs, maybe it's for services. It has to be spent over a particular time frame. The government works with the community to design the process and also determine the values driven by it. At PBP, at our nonprofit, we often, we always demand the equity be part of those values. And then proposals are formulated by community members, vetted by the relevant agency officials, and creates projects that directly serve community needs. And again, the community chooses those projects. PB is done all over the world. There's several thousand cities that do it now. Here, the 2018 estimate, it's in this around 7,000 or close to 8,000. It really got going in Brazil and in Latin America, and then it kind of jumped to Europe. Then it came to the United States. You can see a lot less processes in the United States. It's recently gotten more into Asia, more into Central Africa, and continues to evolve and is done in very different ways in different places. You can see that there are now close to a dozen countries that mandate PB. That is, they mandate that there be genuine public participation in spending money. And everybody who's interested in MMT, everybody who's interested in a job guarantee, anybody who's interested in remaking Federal Reserve banks or central banks, right? That's really interesting, right? That the national governments would dictate that there has to be some sort of genuinely participatory process when it comes to allocating funds from a budget. So what if we use PB, again, here it is and how it works in New York on the left, and the target, right, the goal was actually to choose the actual projects, in this case, the green roofs, that the city has already passed the law of what should happen. So here, and PB can be done in all different kinds of ways. This would be called a thematic PB, where the theme then is green green infrastructure, it's energy democracy, it's climate resilience, it's climate justice. And then the community would actually formulate the proposals to bring that about within the specific theme. And what this does is it allows the problems that a job guarantee can run into, right? Which is that it's top down, that there'll be lots of corruption, that, who's going to determine where these jobs go and what kind of projects are they working on? What about patronage? What about just poorly conceived projects? What about ones that aren't really connected to what are the chief needs? So to utilize PB to be able to determine the projects, and then they're in a sense funded by the job guarantee. And those workers, those jobs then can be in the sphere which brings about the values that we're hoping to put at the core of this project. So we sometimes call this energy democracy when we're talking about climate change. And this is where community has the control over where the renewable resource generation goes, so solar or wind or battery storage, and the community owns it. And also there are businesses in the sphere which are worker cooperatives, also adhering to our principles of economic democracy, which then could utilize the job guarantee to help pay for the workers in worker cooperatives, again, working in this particular sector. There's a co-op there's a kind of federation of co-ops called Co-op Power, which already does this throughout the Northeast, obviously without the job guarantee, but links together different efforts to create worker co-ops in the energy sector, especially solar co-ops. And they just created, in conjunction with We Act, great environmental justice organization in New York City, a new worker co-op that installs solar panels called Solar Uptown. And again, this is a great book on the energy democracy movement and different programs associated with it. And then again, the idea is that not only is there employment in it, but through leveraging that funding or targeting other funds, that the community actually owns the solar. So the members of those co-ops, in this case, consumer co-ops, right, that enables a kind of community ownership of the solar array, and they're receiving the direct energy from the project. This could also be done in green roofs. Green roofs are green infrastructure that goes on top of buildings. And green infrastructure can be bioswales, it could be rain gardens, it could be plants, it could be vegetables, it could be wildflowers. In New York City, there's this incredibly new, huge green roof on the Javits Center. It even has an orchard. The dirt is 4 feet deep, which is really unheard of. And I'm not going to get too excited about for today. That's a different topic. But so green roofs are examples of projects that really enhance resilience, also get into the issue of local food production, of food democracy, enhance biodiversity, reduce street flooding, which is such a huge issue in New York City, like many other places, is now grappling to deal with that. And these are examples of the kinds of projects that could be generated by a PB, funded in part by a job guarantee, which is fulfilling legislation already passed by the city. Again, this is existing legislation. The danger, though, in that kind of legislation, right, is who gets it? Where does the project go? That's solved by PB to make sure it goes to enhance equity. And who funds the project? Who gets the jobs? And that is handled by the job guarantee portion. So participatory budgeting plus job guarantee gets you energy and food democracy, climate justice, and resilience. Thanks very much. It's just mathematics, Andres. You just plug them in and boom, climate justice.
Easy peasy.
That's it. So, back to Andres.
Alrighty. Thank you very much, Professor Menser. And we will now turn to Rebecca, who will tell us how to integrate democracy into our souls and our culture.
I love that. Mike, do you still have this? I can do a screen share and I can run the screens. Let's see if that works.
I can absolutely do it, or do you want to do it?
Do you see it? Did it work?
You are there. Now you got to do present, I think. Yeah.
Okay. I'll do my best.
Great.
Thanks. It's loading. Okay. Got it? Thank you so much. This is really good for us to all talk together on this with all of you in the room. How and where do we learn and promote the skills and knowledge and values of democracy? Andre spoke about the macro, the meso, and the micro, and I think it's important that we recognize that with all the colonialism that has oppressed so many, whether we call it sexism, racism, go on down the list of all of the oppression, people don't necessarily know how to show up and be ready for that human flourishing that you mentioned. So I think a lot of it is also, how do we think about where we learn this? And, okay. New York City, just as a banner that was done, and thank you, both of you, for really talking about some of the history of New York. This banner was done by the worker co-op movement a few years ago that looks at the history of co-ops in New York City, which really goes back to understanding some of what solidarity looked like in the 30s and then in the 60s with the Black Panthers and moving into co-op housing and all the way up to this legislation that was pretty exciting when we got the city money for worker co-ops, which over the 8 years has burgeoned to about 15 million in total. This is an example. This is an old slide. I wasn't able to get a new one for today, but by 2018, this is all the locations in our 5 boroughs that were developing and having worker co-ops get started. But what we realized pretty early on is that people needed to learn how to do this. Democracy in place is not what we have been taught. There's a lot of, just tell me what to do. What does the boss want? People have lost agency with so much oppression and how people are told to report to work or not report to work or what to do and not to do. So really trying to think about how we get this out into the practice, small spaces and large. And I say it's really about scaling culture change. Any place is the right place. See if I can get rid of that other image. There you go. So it's also scaling kindness and really thinking, if we use something as simple as being kind, maybe we can shift some of that hierarchical power. And all of the ideas that are coming through with a job guarantee and looking differently at participating as part of the new democratic reality we aim for, we need people to feel welcomed with kindness, understanding transparency, understanding active listening. If people were never shown a budget before, how do you think they might respond to a budget to build bathrooms in the schools, if that's one of the things coming through participatory budgeting, as shameful as that is? Bathrooms in schools was one of the things we needed to fund. So understanding the processes and procedures so that people can engage, but also I really say heal, that the impact of ages of colonialism on top of so much of our capitalist society means that people are traumatized in all these nooks and crannies of their life. And how do we use engagement as a time where people can can strengthen their capacity to be part of the change? So I love this because I want to say this exists even in nursery school, right? This scaling this is saying that we can learn how to be kind everywhere, which really also means listening and engaging without hierarchical thinking. So some people may know the 7 principles of cooperativism based on, coming from the International Co-op Alliance. The 5th principle is education, training, and information. And anyone that's going to engage in anything that's cooperative could understand that training and education is really important. So the 3 of us coming out of the City University of New York and the New School were saying, let's pay attention to the education that's needed along the way. But any entity that forms itself as a co-op, or even just to act cooperatively, they have to learn how to do it. And what does that begin to look like and feel like? So again, this is the micro, but because scaling can happen in all these places, we need to teach how do people cooperate. So everywhere, it's the culture we promote. We can learn it, we can do it, we can relearn it, but there's not a wrong place. So I like to reference Paulo Freire, who really says, liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transfers of information. So how do we help people feel the liberation of being part of the decision? That picture that Michael Menser shared of 2 side-by-sides of groups. One was a lot of people in the auditorium sort of being forced to listen and shut up while a few people tell them what's going to happen, versus sitting around in a circle and really thinking together, hands raised, engaged. It's messy, but it's wonderful when you can do it because everybody gets engaged. And that's part of recognizing this cognition that I'm engaged in being part of the change. If it comes down to a green roof on my school or your school, how do we figure out the best place? So I like to say, well, when we had to start putting together education and training in New York City, because the worker co-op movement was growing, and there I was based at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. What do people need to learn to run effective, democratically controlled entities? We want to be ready for the change so that we can run it as we start to change what currently exists. And so we identified that you really need to work from the heart, the people, the hands, which is the operation, but also the globe, the political context. And that there's not a wrong door. There's just these different ways that we need to make sure people understand the change they are part of when they're involved in cooperatively, democratically shifting power and producing things. So I say the heart, the hands, and the globe. And when I say the hands, there's also 2 aspects. It's the finances of the thing, and it's also the skills of the thing, the hard skills. So part of when I say people are the heart of the matter, it's also what does true belonging look like? What has generations of capitalist thinking done? It's really beat upon us. And how do we make sure that we're here to relate to and care for each other? Certainly in small places, people know this. They know it in family, they know it in jobs, in caring professions. I just left a class with a dozen elementary school teachers thinking about how they have to engage their groups, their classes, to be more engaged. And you see that people really strive for inclusive processes, that that's something that we want when we want to be the change. So how do we do the inclusive processes? So we need to have multiple places. There's not a wrong place. We need to have active learning and active listening so people can upend the power dynamics and listen to the most marginalized. And this goes back to in the process, in that micro process of running things, we can start healing and give power back to the grassroots of what we want, which is to have a democratic process for people to be engaged. I like to say there's no wrong place, and look at all these different places where we can teach and learn to be engaged democratically. I remember, we're positioned at the university, so we're thinking a lot about how to do this at the university level. But I come out of workforce development training, and people can learn this on the job, or businesses can learn this as they transition to more cooperative ways of managing, or classes can learn this. We've been talking about participatory budgeting. What if in the school the classes get money to distribute, and they have to figure out how do I and we in this group distribute those funds to the project we all agree on. So there's so many ways and places to do this. It's again, scaling is in a million places, not one big one. So I say there's not a wrong place to learn this and teach this and promote this. It's a combination of wherever people are. There's not a wrong door. The journey is here for everywhere we go. And without going into all the details of what does it look like, it does look a lot like people get to learn what I said earlier, the heart, the hands, and the globe, so that you understand the bigger system you're part of. You understand the way the operations of a business may operate, but you also can understand how you listen to each other and bring the best out in people. So I want to, I think I'll close that sharing, and we'll probably open up to some questions and dialogue. Okay. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. Okay, so we can open it up now for questions from the Q&A box, or we also just keep dialoguing. We have a little under 30 minutes, and we can open it up. Maybe in the meantime, while people think of some questions and add some, I'm curious if I could hear comments from you all on this issue of public infrastructure. Rebecca, can you mute yourself really quick? Sorry about that. No worries. Thank you. So I think when we think about productive capacity in a qualitative dimension, what comes to my mind is, of course, how to arrange political and economic participation to address all of these traumas and inequalities that were just mentioned, right? On gender lines, on racial lines, on class lines, etc. I'm curious if you all could expand a little bit on the role of public space and public infrastructure to make this happen, to hit those qualitative dimensions. One of the places that come to mind, of course, as was mentioned, is the school system and the spaces we have K through 12 and the role of universities, that given that they're anchor institutions in communities. So I was hoping you all could expand on that a bit.
I'll start and then let Michael step up. So much belongs in the public sphere. And what does it mean when we have things in the public sphere that we all use every day, but that don't have the rights to decide on how that gets used? So this is part of that human flourishing that can be reinstituted or instituted if together everybody who uses a resource gets to decide. So whether it's a school building or a college campus, as two examples that we are touching on, how do we make sure that people understand the value of that space and that it's ours to control? So I think there was, when I was earlier, I think yesterday at the forum, and one of the opening plenaries was with Anthony Kwame Appiah, and he said, there's a pattern of deference of the working class, and we have to undo that. And how do you undo this pattern of deference is you figure out ways to deeply engage. So just what do you asking people what they think, what they imagine, what can be, is part of that process, whether it's fixing something in a school, deciding what we're going to grow in our garden, or that we have, with this budget, how many tools and which tools are we going to buy, becomes part of the micro of engaging people as citizens in the thing they're engaged in, which they've been alienated from for too long. Mike?
Yeah, and we really don't talk about the public enough. We defend it too much, and we don't talk about it enough. You know what I mean? Like, we want to save the money and save the budget and prevent the cuts and this kind of thing, but the conceptualization around the public is not keeping up with where we are as a society or where the challenges are. And I think there's the educational level and a real lack of universities to really think about their public function, because they get caught in this impasse between the humanities and the classic sort of, still this kind of classic model of education, which I'm in philosophy, I'm in the humanities, and reading texts, and the idea that more people should have access to this kind of level of intellectual activity and discourse, right? So there's that. And then there's like training people for jobs, and whatever happened, to the other aspect of like, well, this, the universities are supposed to be creating the knowledge and to really be cultivating the persons who are the stewards of the public, the creators of the public. And here we mean the decommodified public, right? The public goods that we all need access to, that make us healthy, that make us civil, that make us educated, that make us collaborative. And this the simple act of Brooklyn College student government doing PB, and and look, it was a pretty low stakes process, but they were so grateful for it because they have very few opportunities to do something that means something with other students where they're setting the agenda. And it's considered to be part of the educational process. And the campus itself, there's a whole, tradition of a place-based learning where, if you're learning about hydrodynamics, the students retain the information if you're at the beach as opposed to in the lab. Like, this is one of the great no shit discoveries of all time, right? I remember it better if I was at the beach than if I was in the lab. The same thing with the campus and looking at stormwater, looking at the wildflowers, looking at grass and what grass does or what doesn't do. We have a sustainable urban gardens course at Brooklyn College for the first time. We have an urban gardens course that's part of the curriculum. We've had other, kind of summer courses before. What? How is that possible, right? So, and when you do that, when you do these kinds of educational, spaces, then you connect with not just the public goods, but with you see what other community needs are. And cities need to think about investing in these physical infrastructure sites the way that they used to think of subsidizing development, right? So rather than subsidizing the new high rise to get your drugstore at the bottom and your luxury condos at the top, and you hope for jobs from that, then why not invest in the campuses, which also help you address the ecological crisis and the energy crisis through solar, through green roofs, through all this, and then are also spaces for learning for the students there in context of the problems of the community with the public.
That's great. And, I kind of want to take this opportunity as well to add to that by drawing from some work done by my colleagues, Scott Ferguson and Max Seho, along with Ben Wilson, that I think can really add to this conversation of the macro and the micro, and how doing something at one scale can push the larger scale as well. And so in when it comes to universities and public universities, something we always hear as of late is that, of course, there's no money. CUNY's broke. The state has got us on a certain kind of budget, et cetera, et cetera. There's all this problem about how we're constantly being reduced in our capacity to have the resources to do things. Yet at the same time, CUNY has all kinds of resources: students, intellectual resources, buildings, property, all kinds of things that have not mobilized, that are not being mobilized because of this idea or this myth that there's just no money for it, and the inaction by state and federal authorities to do so. So in this proposition, the kind of the insight of MMT and money and credit was brought in to go beyond the notion that, obviously the strongest currency in our system is the US dollar, but there are ways to add kind of complementary dynamics of credit into the system. And so they propose this idea called the uni as a kind of complementary currency that can be administered by the CUNY system or by any public university system in order to mobilize provisioning and production of a certain ecosystem to get things done. And, with the right kind of political organizing and mobilizing, this uni can be taken, to pay property taxes for the city, can be accepted or redeemable at certain local businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the interesting things about this is it can get things moving. It creates a very important conversation on mobilizing resources that we're not using, that we're being lied to and told there's no money for. But I think it also starts to put pressure on rethinking central banking, as Mike, you mentioned, because it's in the Federal Reserve's interest that if something as complex as a university-led complementary currency system unfolds in New York City, that they make sure that there isn't a crisis or that the system doesn't blow up in the same way that it backstops, protects the private financial system as a lender of last resort, as stepping in when it needs to, as doing QE when it needs to, et cetera, et cetera. We can start to put political pressure on the Federal Reserve either to backstop or protect this system, or to straight up purchase or use what's called swap lines to basically buy unis and convert them into dollars in a similar way that sometimes is used in international development. And so obviously, like here, there's questions about inflation and productive capacity, and all of this become, again, political, become questions of like communities to determine these sorts of things. So I'm curious on if you all have thoughts on this idea.
I think the micro is buried inside the communities to determine. So when people feel like they're a part of a community and together they're figuring out a need, so much power is unleashed. And it's complex, right? It's complex because we're not taught how to resolve conflict very well together. But as we learn that, this becomes the experiment that we're going forward. So we're all facing the existential threat of climate change. We're trying to figure out really in all these different places, what can I do? What can you do? Is there anything we can do? And by creating intentional communities to think this through with a budgeted item or a demand for that budget, and to say we're going to do this, whether it's we're going to open up this piece of land on the college campus that they're not letting us open because we need to have a garden, and then we're going to have this food, and what happens when that food is more than 4 of us could use? How do we think about sharing it? These are the kinds of decisions in the micro that give people more of that agency that they're going to need as they go out, but it also gives them that agency to say we're part of the solution. And I think there's a lot of this. What does it mean to decommodify the stuff we have while we democratize how we handle it?
Right.
Yeah, and there's the proposal you mentioned. I was looking for this. The Bob Hockett's book on financing the Green New Deal, and there's definitely different financial instruments. Some involve the Fed, some involve other kinds of institutions, to think about how universities and/or public institutions could be part of that. And and it's interesting, right? Because you can think about the proposal you're mentioning, Andres, and as well as Bob Hockett's, some of the stuff he's thinking about. And then, like Rebecca's saying, there's also the land that the universities own. There's the assets of the physical of university in terms of the building and the HVAC and the roofs, right? And to me, and thinking about the conference with the democratize, decarbonize, and decommodify, I really think that part of the reason that we so often have that kind of model investment that goes in the private sector, because it returns that surplus that can be captured by those who invest, and public institutions at their best don't return that, right? The good that they produce is a non-exclusive good. It can be enjoyed by many people. There isn't that kind of capture of the privatization of the surplus. That's what decommodification is. I mean, that's in part what decommodification is. And I love it with roofs, because as New Yorkers know, there's this period over the last 20 years where building owners were selling off their air rights, right? Selling off their air rights so others could develop that land above what the current ceiling or roof was. And now green roofs, right? Green roofs are just the opposite, where you're saying, hey, that space actually matters for all of us. And you better capture some soil water. You better plant some flowers. You better put some panels up there because we're short of that. And so they can be spaces of this of kind of public capture of benefits that are allocated and distributed in these non-exclusive ways. And that's the decommodification part. And public goods are very well situated to decommodify, particularly when it comes to energy and water. And again, in something like a green roof, which is on the ecosystem side, as well as a genuine, possible social space, and so on.
Great. Do we have any questions? Don't be shy. I can keep them coming. Go ahead and ask them in the question tab. Well, the other thing that comes to mind that I think is really important in connecting these macro relationships is, of course, the 1970s New York City fiscal crisis and the role that the federal government had in declaring that there was no money left, and so New York City was supposed to drop dead, right, in that famous headline. So, it has this double effect of naturalizing austerity and then creating the conditions for this total commodification of city structures. So I'd love to hear more some of the consequences of that on efforts that we've been putting forward for the last 10 years and beyond, right? And where you all think some spaces of overcoming that are. Of course, for me, I think it's vital to ensure that we develop the policies and the mandates from the federal level so that telling any city to drop it is impossible, because we've institutionalized what would often be called automatic stabilizers, where our fiscal policy responds to problems because it has to meet human needs by law.
Andres, you went off camera. I'm not sure why, but I think it's interesting to think about the automatic stabilizer that can happen in crisis by humans, and that's something that when we face these crises like we are facing right now through this pandemic, what else happens? So I know we've seen all over the world really more and more mutual aid being honored as a way that people are showing up. How do we support that structurally so we don't just base it on austerity, you go help yourself, but actually understanding that people come together to help each other, and that's a strength, and that's something that we can do some strength-based strategizing on and say, how do we do that more? And then take that to some of the public funding that we deserve.
Yeah, 100%, because the disinvestment creates a kind of vacuum where people create these, mutual aid networks. They occupy blocks, they occupy buildings, they build gardens, they create informal economies in order to survive, and also to get, and to also have pleasure and joy and meaningful relationships. But what happens is that they all stay on the margins. They all are confined to particular niches, and they don't touch the logic of the city. Some actually accuse it of helping to perpetrate the logic of the city, right? I don't like to use that language, but you can see that, the city can just continue to kind of stay in its core, and literally you're on the periphery, right? And in New York City, it was geographically the case too, right? The outer boroughs, or that kind of characterization. So the question is, how do those efforts link together to change the core logic of the city? And that's where your public institutions come back in. Again, your public university, that's our territory. That should be the connective tissue in terms of the physical space, in terms of education, in terms of programming, in terms of who's there, who gets to come there, and who can collaborate in that space. And bringing in the expert knowledges with the community folks, with the community knowledges, and helping to politicize the expert folks, and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's the real challenge. And that's why you've seen a lot of folks in our space, in the economic democracy space, like the worker co-op folks, go after the city council. We captured the city council. It took us a while. And about 15 years ago, we got the majority of the city council to really pay attention to this stuff. Some of them are even us, right? So that's a space where we've done pretty well. We haven't really done it at the mayoral level. I mean, a little bit, you know, I'm not going to demonize or romanticize de Blasio, but a little bit there, but not really. Even though the opportunity was there after 08, right? Unbelievable. And the opportunity got squandered. So I really see public utilities, public institutions as the places that should be ours. That's our territory to connect all these other efforts that can help preserve the autonomy of these efforts, but also empower and resource these efforts and help connect them. And I see that's where the fight is. I think the fight's gonna be over public services. We've already seen this even with the concept of essential workers, the way it's gotten stretched out, broadened, and fractured at the same time. And we're going to see it with energy and water, right? You know, energy costs are on their way up right now. This is going to be, you know, this is the next phase of a lot of tension and conflict. It's going to be this new global energy crisis. How do we get this model into that space as the solution to this latest crisis that we're getting as the COVID climate, you know, dance of horror continues?
I see that Pavlina asked a question in the chat, and I wanted to make sure that you both see it. Thank you, Pavlina. She thanks us for the work and conceptual practical ideas. What's the kind of concrete organizing that we can do to put full employment on the local policy agenda? And I'll just say that I saw that in the chat. I do think that the crises we are facing, plural, is our opportunity. So that's part of what we have to say. It's possible to do full employment now because this is part of the change that needs to happen. There's so much to be built. Let's go to work. And we have to shape some of that to go better than it is. The city just instituted an emergency plan of the cleanup corps. It was a little under thought through and not good enough, but a cleanup corps. But we already have $15 an hour minimum wage. So it's now like right sized in terms of what people are being paid. Now, if they can be trained and it can be used for something that's going to be more than cleaning up graffiti, we're going to have some good work there, ideally.
I would add to that I think working with local efforts, municipal politics, and all these experiments to help ask the question in the process of organizing itself, what if we had a sustainable, job guarantee driven full employment agenda? How would that accelerate, add, contribute to, and develop the efforts that we are on principle and qualitatively organizing around? And those practices, I think, can stir up our imagination, both to, think, how could a full employment job guarantee agenda make this even better? And also to overcome this dichotomy between, anything at the macro level is reinforcing the state, and, only the macro level matters and the micro level isn't doing anything, right? I think we need to overcome this and see how these agendas are complementary. I think that a Green New Deal through a job guarantee is the alternative to neoliberalism. And local efforts are going to give the form and the quality that needs to truly overcome the devastation of the last few decades. Mike?
Yeah, I think there's two routes, and I was listening to a panel this morning on this, and folks know a lot more about certain of these details than I do. But I one route is, and Andres and I have debated this over large beers before, but there are these civilian conservation corps, which are not in full employment programs, right? But are jobs programs where people, a certain group of folks are guaranteed jobs, or there's guaranteed jobs in a certain sector, and FDR did the Civilian Conservation Corps at the state level before he got federal, right? He tried out some things there. It's a different model, I understand. But I wonder about that. Is that an efficacious way of, where states have some room to maneuver? They don't require the big federal decision on it to move forward on that. And you could certainly see that in the resilience space, right? There's there's urgent public demand for it. I mean, just managing stormwater right now, New York, we lost 13 people, because the remnants of a hurricane, not because of a hurricane, because the remnants of a hurricane. It's horrifying. And the amount of work that needs to be done, and de Blasio threw $400 million at it instantly, right? Oh, okay. Where's that $400 million going to go? And that gets to the flip side. Part of the way to create the conceptual space and the attractiveness and the doability of a job guarantee is to show how it can be accountable at the local level. And I think participatory budgeting is one way that can be tangible for communities, that, it's going to go to paying people to do work on this project, which is tailored to our needs. It's not imposed on us, and is also vetted by the city and all the folks that need to vet it. And that's the kind of coalition that you need to really make it look genuine, addressing genuine need and genuine aspirations of the community. And so, but I wonder about, and look, and there's other things besides PB. I'm not saying PB fits everything, but it certainly plays one role here. But I do wonder about, the conservation corps. Rebecca and I have talked about this too. Is that an intermediate model here or not? Or is it something different? There's AmeriCorps, right? There's these other things. Are they distractions? Do we got to say we need to get rid of these things? Are they distractions? Are they non-reformist reforms, as we used to say, or are they distractions?
So all for the non-reformist reforms, which means change that matters, change that sticks.
Right.
Big invisible enemy in the room is neoliberal policies that will keep popping up. But I think of school food. So the Black Panthers, and that was in that timeline when we looked at New York City banner of solidarity economy. Black Panthers seized the means of production and started bringing food to kids at the schools. Every morning there was a breakfast program, there was a lunch program. It was the government's responsibility to do that, but the people did it. It came from a grassroots revolutionary effort that said, we're going to do it. So there's this dance of being the advance guard and saying, screw the fact that our government's not doing it, we're going to do it. And then the government comes in and does what they're supposed to do for better and for worse, and that's the neoliberal policy. Are they doing it for good? It is their responsibility to make sure our people are fed. That is good. And so following suit like that, saying, okay, like that, we want to now bring that conservation core that was just okay into something that really is going to be a policy that structures full employment for solutions that are going to help with the environment, which are just so needed. So trying to make sure there's this dance back and forth, with some of us really being the conscience of, is this really structural change? And then I go back to the micro idea of making sure people have voice, which does something to help, there's education has to happen along with that, not just how do we make decisions, but what does deep change mean, is giving people that agency, which comes with education and cultivation. And so it's sort of like, in the problem, we're going to find the solution, which is a permaculture philosophy. That's in permaculture. In nature, they say, where there's a problem is exactly where you're going to find the solution. So we have to go into that and not be sidetracked with someone telling us it's the right way or the wrong way.
Yeah, so Pavlina, and we're running out of time here, so we can wrap up. But Pavlina makes a great in the chat about transitioning away from social provisioning based on volunteer work, which oftentimes has been what falls on mutual aid groups or on kind of radical organizing, to something that's paid, because again, that expands your control over your local participation when you have the income that you need and the services that you need provisioned by the government. And I think this is kind of what a full employment job guarantee agenda starts to do: institutionalize many of the great resilient networks that are created. And the other thing I'll say is that the CCC, the WPA, these programs, right? The first New Deal had the caveat that Roosevelt had to make coalitions with Southern Dixiecrats and very racist people. And we have now lived through an intersectional movement, a feminist movement, many municipal and anarchist movements. I think we have a lot of lessons and insights from this to leverage against a conventional top-down exclusionary welfare state, and to recognize that no government, no program exists in a one single form, but rather it's up for grabs for us to shape in the way that that we can and that we want to. Closing remarks, very quickly.
Well, I think on the anniversary of Occupy, the 10th-year anniversary of Occupy, there was, this is what democracy looks like. And I had my students reflect on it, some of them who were very young at the time. And it was very interesting to see how what's rolling out in the We Are the 99%, more recently, channeling the meaning of George Floyd's murder and understanding Black Lives Matter, really what allyship looks like. There's a movement that is pushing us to the left so that people are not going to be settling for halfway solutions. And we have to help articulate that and make sure we're pushing that at every level, as you refer to the micro, the meso, and the macro.
Yeah, don't settle. And we're in a system change moment that's so intense, and the catastrophes, are upon us, but in a way that the remaking of all our key institutions is literally up for grabs. From and just look at Facebook. Finally we got some bipartisanship, right? And Facebook has brought folks together in opposition to their logic, and that logic is the same logic as you see all across the economy, right? It's just Facebook is so intensely evilized it, that it's very visible, and thank you, thanks to them. And I think that we have to think systematically and intimately, like we always, try to do. And we need public institutions, we need public education to do that. And so we have to be very clear about which territories are ours and make sure we go claim them. And if they're not responding to us, we need to make sure that they do. And it might be our utilities, it might be our schools, but those are two big ones. And then it's system change time. And this is, I love this conference because it's big picture about what this would look like, And it's got a history to it. It's got failures to it. And now we have the opportunity, like Andres was saying, to be in this cross-cultural, cross-sectoral learning space to make it a lot better.
Alrighty. Well, I want to thank Mike Menser, Rebecca Lurie, and everybody for joining us today. It was a wonderful discussion, very exciting stuff, and hopefully we can all stay connected on the future post-Facebook social media society.